Good morning. This is a webinar about PSD2 and strong customer authentication. And we are sending this live from the DIBS office here in Stockholm on a gray day. My name is Patrick Müller. I work as an e-commerce expert. And with me, I have my colleague from Nets, Nabil Musa. Good morning.
Good morning, Patrick.
How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah, not completely good, are you?
Well, I suffer from a little bit of allergies around this time of year, so
we can expect some sneezing, or
hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
I'm in good spirits at least.
Great. Before we start, just a few words about this format if you aren't familiar with it. We are recording this, but also if you have any questions, you have a tab in your client where it says questions, and we would love to have questions regarding these subjects we're talking about today. If you want to test the question field, you can just write hi or something else there right now. If you're on a mobile device, if you see the picture on the right, you have a tab below at the bottom of the screen says questions. Click that and you can write a question. And your questions are anonymous. We won't say who you are or anything like that. It's just me who see who you are, so you can really ask us anything. So try it out right now. There are some suggestions here. Blow your nose, someone says here, tips for you. I don't know if that's useful. Okay, thanks for testing the question field. We are going right into it. This is a little bit a heavy subject, won't you say?
I would say that, yeah. I mean, there's lots of, this is a wholesale shift for the industry as a whole. So where we are today and where we will be on the 15th of September is quite a different place, especially when we talk about e-commerce transactions. And there's a road to get there. There's a number of steps you need to take into account as a merchant to make sure you're in the right place for September. But we'll go through that today. So hopefully by the end of this hour, we'll definitely have a much clearer picture of what you need to do and where we'll be.
And the heaviness of the subject comes almost naturally because it's something from the EU, right?
I don't want you to ascribe too much from the fact that I'm answering this as a British person, but yes, the regulations from the EU tend to be a bit vague sometimes, especially in an industry as complicated as ours. I mean, I don't want to overplay the complication, but we have many years of use case development and scheme rules, and all of these things can't be oversimplified. And so we need to try and make sense of the jungle that is a strong customer authentication, definitely.
Well, gets into it, or make sense of it.
I'll try my best. So I just thought we'd start with a quick introduction of myself, so you know my background and a little bit more about me. So I started my, payments journey, at least at Visa in London, where I was working in the corporate strategy team before I moved over to Nets a couple of years ago to work on PSD2 related activities. And since that time, I've been engaging with a large range of the industry stakeholders on exactly what is required from strong customer authentication, but how do we make sure we're performing optimally as a PSB like DIBS, but also as an acquirer that Nets is. So that involves conversations with card schemes, that involves conversations with also non-card payment bodies, which is, for example, the Berlin Group, and then also the regulators across each of the Nordic countries at least. And then, of course, issuers and merchant. I think issuer conversation and merchant conversation actually where I learn the most, because that's where it starts to get real. All the other, let's say, boxes on that page talk about theory. When I speak to merchants, we really start to get real about what does the customer have to do in practice. So I just wanted to start with set the scene. What can we expect to achieve by the end of this webinar? The first thing I think is understand the implications and impact of PSD2. What is it that the PSD2 regulation states, and what does that mean for the merchants? But also then from moving on from that, what do you need to do as a merchant to be prepared for all the changes that come with strong customer authentication? And the timeline is actually quite tight now. So we had a webinar a month ago, and we're now a month from that point. And the regulation comes sooner and sooner. So 14th of September is now the implementation date, and everyone will disappear for summer as well. So, you know, it really gets tight. Then also, I guess for everyone to understand what Nets, and I include DIBS in Nets here, we're all part of the same payments group. What we are doing to make sure that we are equipping merchants with the right tools that they need for the challenges that come with strong customer authentication. But actually not to see it as just a challenge, but actually see it as an opportunity to move beyond just compliance, say, okay, how do we make sure that this works best for us? And then I think I've covered, this is actually a new addition from the last webinar. So if you're joining today, you've got the most up-to-date information, but there were a few new revelations, let's say, in the last week or so relating to strong customer authentication. And that really talks to your point, Patrick, earlier around the heaviness and complication of the topic, that we still have new information coming from the EBA, despite the fact that we're sort of 2 months only away from the regulation. So we've had a 3-year process, but new information still come to us week by week in preparation for September. So
you really need to keep an open mind about these things.
It's definitely, you can think of it as slightly a work in progress. And we can come on to timelines later and what we can expect from them. So let's start with the overview of the regulation, always a good place to start. I'll cover it quite quickly and only really touch on the key points that are related to strong customer authentication. If we had to summarize strong PSD2, I would put it down to three things. One is something called access to account. We're not going to focus on that today. But access to account basically refers to banks needing to provide some type of access, primarily API access to consumers' bank accounts. With that access, third parties, fintechs, payment service providers like us, can connect to those accounts and provide account information services and payment initiation services. Those are all related to direct bank account services. So,
and this is a super exciting and interesting change that opens up a lot of opportunities, but that's a separate webinar, I think.
Exactly. We'll have a separate webinar on those things, but definitely creating alternative. I mean, the ambition of this regulation in general, I'll cover sort of the long list, but is also to open up competition as well as regulate and increase security. Then comes strong customer authentication. So the topic for today, setting the rules around what is and isn't required when a consumer is making a payment. And this covers not just online payments, but actually offline payments, so in-person payments as well. These two elements of PSD2 are covered by something called the regulatory technical standards. They are, let's say, a sub-element to the overarching PSD2 framework, which go into the details around what is required. Something that should be familiar by now, these have been implemented for more than a year, technically from January 2018, but a restriction on surcharging for consumer credit and debit cards. So the regulated or interchange fee regulated products can no longer have surcharge on them.
So basically you cannot take any fees for just for the payments.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. So the objectives of PSD2, I touched on them earlier, but the overarching regulatory objectives are to increase the number of payment options that comes with the access to account, new non-card alternative payments. Increase the innovation, and innovation can happen both around access to account, but also strong customer authentication when it comes to utilizing exemptions, and also to increase competition. So open up access. I mean, these are, I guess, overarching European payments objectives. We want to create one single market with consistent rules across Europe. That's fair for the customer, but also encourages innovation from the provider or service provider side. So how should you as a merchant see these elements of PSD2? I think from the access to account perspective, see it as simply a new way to accept payments, an alternative to card, using account to account rails, so A2A equals account to account. And then from a strong customer authentication perspective, you should think of it as an increase in security, but at the same time, yes, a challenge to user experience. More steps in the payment journey, of course, is what we call friction. And that could have an impact on customers. But again, it depends on implementation and how you see that as a merchant, and also the prevailing conditions in the market that has a big impact. But ultimately, there could be some influence over conversion. And then surcharging is basically what it says on the tin. You can no longer surcharge on European consumer and credit and debit cards. But I should mention at this point, by the way, that corporate cards are exempt from that. And so are non-European cards. So an American consumer shopping on a European website, for example, can still be surcharged. So as you can see, there's sort of a mix of factors here. One is very compliance-related, strong customer authentication, and surcharging, but then access to account opens up opportunities as well. So today we'll focus on strong customer authentication. What does that mean from the merchant perspective? Is it just friction, or can there be alternatives around it? And what do you need to do to be compliant, I think?
Before we launch the poll, we already have a few questions.
Okay, let's
dig into them. What does strong customer authentication in direct bank payments mean in practice? Is Payment PSD2 compliant automatically when the customer uses their internet bank codes for making a payment?
Essentially, yes, direct bank payments today would have some sort of strong customer authentication already applied to it. Let's use the Swedish example. So you provide some information and then you trigger a bank ID, for example, log into your bank. A bank ID is a strong customer authentication compliant solution, yes. There has been some conversations around the markets on these code cards. In Denmark, where I live, we have the NemID code card. There is some conversation about whether those are actually compliant or not. But if you're using app-based things like NemID, Bank ID, by the way, exists in Norway and Sweden. Those are compliant authentication methods. So logging into your bank should be the same.
We're going to shortly talk about exactly what we mean with strong customer authentication, but it's really important also to know that this is really the house of this is really aimed at other parties than the merchant. It's aimed at the bank,
yes,
basically.
So the bank is the one who the bank is, let's say, the first line of responsibility for ensuring strong customer authentication is happening, but then also happening in the right way. So you can think of strong customer authentication as synonymous with two-factor authentication. So the customer providing two different parts of their identity or ways to identify themselves. But we'll come on to the actual structure of strong customer authentication.
Another question here, is this applicable for Trustly payment gateway as well?
I think the way the regulation is worded, it's applicable to all electronic payment methods, whether that's card, non-card, other types of payments. It's all applicable, yes. There are some things are in scope and out of scope, but the regulation as a whole focuses on all electronic payments. So card, non-card, online and offline as well. So the payments I make in a shop, in person, also comes under the rules of strong customer authentication.
Great. We have a few more questions. Keep them coming. We're going to launch a poll now. And if you look at your screen, you have a question here. Do you feel you understand the impact of PSD2 and strong customer authentication SCA? It's yes, no, or really don't know. I'm not sure. So just put in your votes, and you have a few more seconds before we close the poll and present the result. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, we close it. And here we're gonna share it with you. Okay, yes, 48% have an understanding of the impact of PSD2 and strong customer authentication, 22% doesn't have that, and 30% doesn't really know. And well, what do you think about the results?
I would say that that's an improvement on other polls I've seen around Europe from at least a month ago.
Yeah, pretty impressive. Yeah. Almost half of the audience. That's good. That's really good.
Well, let's hope we can clarify the rest for the other 50%.
Let's hope it doesn't get any lower after this webinar.
Maybe let's not check now. So let's go into it then. So what is strong customer authentication? I think you can simplify it as two-factor authentication. So as it says in the black text, when strong customer authentication is required, 2 out of the following 3 factors of authentication must be supplied by the payer. When we talk about authentication, what we really mean, by the way, is is identifying and validating the identity of whoever is making the payment. So we want to actually minimize the occasions where a stolen card, for example, can be used for a payment. So the way you do that, I think, is to verify that there's something that the consumer only knows, like a PIN code or a password. So we call that the knowledge factor of authentication. Then we have the possession factor of authentication. That's something that the payer or user only has. So only one of them exists. A mobile device or some sort of other token can be a possession factor. And then there's also, I guess, the most future-looking authentication factor, which is inherent. So this is something I am. My fingerprint, for example, facial recognition, finger vein scanning, iris scanning, the list goes on actually these days with cooler and cooler stuff. So when a payment is required, an authentication required, then the customer must provide two of these three factors. So they can provide knowledge and possession, knowledge and inherence, inherence and possession. They must be independent of each other. So you can't have two knowledge factors and you can't have two possession factors. You must have one of each. Now, naturally, the question is, if I have to provide these sorts of information, then do more steps in the process equal more chances to drop out? Yes and no. I think it depends on the approach. It depends on how strong customer authentication applied. Actually, it also depends a lot on the consumer. What are they used to doing? In some countries, we do see that the customer actually prefers to do certain things because they feel it's more secure. And if you take those away, they may feel a bit worried. Hey, is this secure? What's this page? Why do I not have to do this anymore? So it's not always a problem.
But once again, to make it perfectly clear here, this is something the card issuer must must make it possible for the consumer to do a strong customer authentication. It isn't anything that the merchant are involved in, really.
No, exactly. It's the issuer that interacts, let's say, with the customer to validate the identity or to do the authentication. And I'll come up with a real tangible example for card payments in a few slides. Yeah. So depending on which payment scenario you're thinking about or which payment method you're thinking about, the tools for strong customer authentication are different. Today, we'll talk about strong customer authentication in an e-commerce context and primarily for card payments. But I mean, if we think about the top line here, strong customer authentication at the point of sale, POS, point of sale. If it's a card payment, then we're inherently doing strong customer authentication today. We just don't know we're doing it. It's not formalized under a regulation. But chip and PIN, for example, is strong customer authentication. If we refer back to the three factors I showed, then the chip or the card is the possession factor. And the PIN code is the knowledge factor. So you have two out of the three factors there. And then for e-commerce, we use 3D Secure to do the authentication. Again, referring back to your question, actually, Patrick, 3D Secure is basically the protocol for the merchant to communicate to the issuer that there's a transaction, and then it's up to the issuer to do the authentication, and they will either interact with the customer by requesting a bank ID or sending them a text message. So it really, as long as we tell the issuer, here's a transaction that needs authenticating, then it's up to the issuer on how they do that and how they want to approve that. So let's go back to basics almost. This is the four-party model, let's say, for card payments, right? We have who are all the stakeholders involved in a card transaction. There's a cardholder, the customer, there's a merchant, there's an acquirer, there's a card issuer who gives the customer their card, and then there are the types of card payments, Visa and MasterCard we'll use as examples today. So let's start with the top right corner. Actually, as a merchant, I send a transaction for authentication. In order to do that, I rely on my PSP, my gateway, to provide me the tools to do that. The PSPs actually rely on the bottom right-hand side of this four-corner model, which is the acquirer who sets the specifications for PSPs. The acquirer is the, let's say, on the merchant side of the ecosystem, the responsible party. So they set the specifications to PSPs, but they're actually not involved directly in the authentication. Then we have the issuer. So again, like we discussed, their primary responsibility for strong customer authentication and approvals. And they are the ones who interact with the customer. So the customer, when required, undertakes an action for authentication. And all of this information flow passes through card schemes.
So for a merchant, you have a relationship with the customer and you have a relationship with the acquirer.
Yes.
That's the parties you interact with,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So your interactions are with customers and acquirers, and let's say the stakeholder that allows you to manage that communication is actually your PSP. So DIBS would manage the tools that you need to accept the payment and also to communicate.
I'm missing a circle here, really. The most important circle.
The DIBS circle.
The DIBS and NEF circle.
Exactly. But this was to show the generic flow. So as a merchant, I mean, technically in the card scheme world, the merchant, it's merchant / PSP.
Exactly.
So it'd be merchant / DIBS, and that comes back to the role that we as DIBS play for merchants, which is we take care of this for you, so that you're technically not present in this. You just do what you do best, which is selling. So I just want to start with the facts, I think, before we go into too much more of the detail. Yes, I think we can say that SCA will have a big impact in the e-commerce world. Friction in payments could rise, and I think that depends on two things. The first thing is how widely 3D Secure is used today. If you as a merchant are using 3D Secure today, then nothing really changes for you on the 14th of September. You continue sending transactions in the way you do. The customers will continue having to do actions or not do actions based on the issuer as they do today. If you're not using 3D Secure, then you will see a change in the way your payments happen. So your customers may be challenged by the issuer to do a strong customer authentication or to provide more information about themselves. And actually what's also very important is the issuer approaches to SCA, because we discussed before that issuers are in control of, one, making sure that SCA happens, but also setting the way that SCA should happen, the method for strong customer authentication. If you have an issuer that uses bank ID, for example, then that's really simple. If there's an issuer that uses something else, then that could be more complicated for the customer. So they determine the method, they determine almost to some extent how frictionful or frictionless the payment experience for the customer is. We don't really determine that as DIBS or even as the acquirer. So for card payments, let's just say that 3D Secure is no longer an opt-in. You must use it. The reason you must use it is that issuers are responsible for strong customer authentication. They have said quite clearly, a lot of the large issuers around Nordics and across Europe, that if you send us unauthenticated transactions, we will now decline them because we have a responsibility to the regulator. It's the law for us to make sure that strong customer authentication happens, and we are liable to the regulator to report the fraud. If our fraud rises, then we have to explain that to the regulator. The good news is, of course, if you're using 3D Secure version 1 for Visa, MasterCard, or the equivalent for other card schemes like American Express or Dankort in Denmark, those are compliant strong customer authentication regulations.
And to be perfectly clear, 3DS1 is the version that everybody's using.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And the reason why I specify 3D Secure version 1 is right at the end of the presentation, I'll come on to a transition that we'll make over time. I don't think it's before September, but to a new version of 3D Secure, which should make the process a little better than it is today, and mobile optimized, for example. But for now, just think from the merchant perspective, as long as I use 3D Secure, forget about versions. 3D Secure, that should make me compliant with strong customer authentication. So it should also be clear, and we've talked a lot about issuers and acquirers and PSPs. I mean, this is a value chain that all needs to be prepared for it to work in practice, for it to be real on the customer side and on the merchant side. The whole value chain needs to be prepared for it. The whole value chain needs to be aligned on what strong customer authentication is and how it should happen. So this will take time before, and we're still continuing on a road to September.
We have been talking about 3D Secure here, and we have a question here. What about other cards as Amex and China Union Pay?
Yeah, they have their own equivalent versions. Amex has something called SafeKey. I'm not sure, can't remember off the top of my head the China Union Pay version, but they all have equivalent 3D Secure. 3D Secure that's a good question, because 3D Secure is basically for now in version 1 solely for Visa, MasterCard and some other schemes, but over time it's going to standardize across all card schemes as well. So we have this body called EMVCo, which sets the standards, and they'll set the standards for version 2 of 3D Secure, which will encompass all the card schemes in some way.
So when we are talking about 3D Secure here, that could mean it could be also for Amex, SafeKey, and for other brands. So it's a placeholder.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. But the PSP will be integrating all of those.
And we are talking about 3D Secure because Visa and MasterCard is, of course, the totally dominant card brands, of course.
Exactly. So I tend to use those as examples because, like in Sweden, there's actually no local scheme. There's only Visa and MasterCard issued. In Denmark, there's a local scheme called Dankort, which is also issued. So Dankort has their own version of 3D Secure called Dankort Secured by Nets. So there are different protocols today. Over time, they'll definitely standardize out. So strong customer authentication, it is a balancing act, I think. As we discussed before, more steps in the payment journey equals more action for the customer, more opportunity to drop out, question mark, maybe. But it's a necessary balancing act at this point in time. Issuers on their side, or banks on their side of the value chain, are responsible for strong customer authentication. They must report fraud. They must basically ensure that these payments are secure. From the merchant perspective, of course, we still also want lower fraud rates. Chargebacks aren't a good thing, but we also want good user experience and good approvals. Essentially, conversion is the thing that matters, and over time, I mean, Patrick, I think we've discussed in the past, the first version of 3D Secure, when it came out with static passwords, for example, caused so much friction in the market. But over time, now we're operating still in a 3D Secure environment, but the user experience is just as good, if not noticeable at all. I mean, consumers may not even notice that 3D Secure is happening. So it's definitely a balancing act that improves over time. And of course, again, to reiterate, it's the issuer that holds the ultimate decision making over strong customer authentication and whether to approve transactions or not. It's nothing that the acquirer or PSP or merchant can influence too much. There are roles to play in requesting things from the issuer, but the issuer is always ultimately responsible for things. So we should be clear, actually, we haven't touched on exactly which type. So actually we did touch on it in the question, but as I mentioned, we'll come back to it. So all payment methods, all electronic payment methods are in scope for strong customer authentication, whether that's a card payment, an account-to-account payment, for example, with direct bank buttons, or mobile wallet payments. Swish, DIBS, Mobile Pay, PayPal, they all have a role to play in strong customer authentication. It doesn't mean that if you're a wallet, you're exempt from it. And then when we talk about channel, in-store or e-commerce, all these types of payment methods are in scope for the regulation.
However, we are talking about electronic payments, and today, if you buy something with invoice, it's basically, from a consumer point of view, a total electronic affair. You don't get any paper invoices or something like that. But that's not included in this, or?
Well, yes and no. So an invoice basically is a promise to pay someone back later. It's offered to you as credit at the point of sale. Now, that's technically not a payment transaction. That's just an agreement to pay. But when you are paying off that invoice, then strong customer authentication applies because you're actually making a transaction. You're making a payment. When you're signing up for an invoice at the point of sale, you're not making a payment. Actually, you're just agreeing to some terms and conditions. So at that point, yes, no strong customer authentication applies. But at the point you have to pay the invoice, strong customer authentication does apply. So there's two steps to that payment journey, actually. Right. One is agreeing to make the payment in the future, and then it's making the payment in the future where strong customer authentication does apply.
Right, great.
There are some types of transactions where strong customer authentication is not required. So as it says clearly in the top line here, they're required for electronic transactions initiated by the customer or the payer. So that's basically initiated by the customer. Let's try and make that as simple as possible. It's me going onto a website, me ordering something and checking out. That's all initiated by me. I'm putting something actively in my basket. I'm ordering something actively with my mobile app. That's very clearly initiated by me. But there are also types of transactions that are initiated by the merchant. For example, a TV streaming subscription. I sign up to it, yes, 1 month, but then the rest of the months I don't actually do anything to make that payment. Those would be something called merchant-initiated transactions. But we'll go into that in detail because I think this in particular has been the most hotly discussed topic in Europe, right? Then there are also MOTO transactions. This is a card scheme word actually, but it stands for mail order, telephone order. So call center payments. I call up as a customer and I read my card details out to the person.
A lot of hotels are using this. You call them directly and book, and they ask you for your card,
exactly.
And you just say it over the phone, and that's a MOTO transaction.
Exactly. So those are out of scope. So no strong customer authentication required on those. And then one leg out transactions where the issuer or acquirer is outside of the EEA. So American cardholder coming to Europe or a European cardholder going outside of Europe to South America, for example, no strong customer authentication required.
So I think here a question will fit right in. Will the SCA address all issuers, banks worldwide, or only in EU?
Yeah, this is a European regulations that only applies to issuers in Europe. And cardholders in Europe to that extent.
Is this a flaw, or is this an opportunity, or what to make of this? The e-commerce industry is global today. Mm-hmm. So is this? Are there any risk with this? Are there any opportunities?
So the objective of the regulation is to increase security of payments in Europe, create some standardization, but then if we look at the modes of strong customer authentication, 3D Secure is actually used across the world. This is used by Visa and MasterCard across the world. So though the regulation is formalizing how we do strong customer authentication does happen around the world anyway. So I don't think it creates some sort of barriers to trade in Europe. I would say that strong customer authentication will happen here, maybe more formalized, but it does happen anyway across the world. So it doesn't create too much of a, let's say, arbitrage or unlevel playing field across Europe for e-commerce. So I think the first question, given what we've just discussed, as a merchant, I would ask myself, which one of my transactions or which segment of my transactions are actually in scope for strong customer authentication and which one of those are not. So for example, which of those transaction types are actually merchant initiated transactions. I have basically in this presentation 3 questions, and I'm going to help answer these questions, but I would say that these are questions, if you're taking notes as a merchant, these are the questions you need to ask yourself and about your payments. So let's try and see some examples of what's in scope and out of scope. A one-off card payment at a web shop, a card on file, post-transaction supermarket, recurring subscriptions, TV streaming subscriptions. So let's go through them one by one. A one-off card payment online at a web shop, that's in scope for strong customer authentication because it's a customer initiated transaction. I'm paying with card and I'm doing something to make sure that that payment happens. Number 2, card on file. Again, there's no real distinction from the regulatory perspective between a one-off card payment online. As a guest, I just enter my card details, or coming to a merchant and having my card details already stored. What matters is that it's a customer initiated transaction. It doesn't matter if the payment details are stored or not. That doesn't really have an influence over whether I'm doing something actively or not. In both situations, I am logging in, putting things into my basket and then checking out. I put in one, I guess, in-person example here. So post-transaction in supermarket, if I check out in the supermarket, I've got things on the conveyor belt. Those are also in scope for strong customer authentication. And then we get to the, I guess, let's say, interesting ones. Number 4, recurring mobile phone subscription with a different amount. These are basically MIT transactions. I have an agreement with the mobile phone company for phone subscription, and I set that up, and then every month I'm charged according to my usage. But I don't actually do anything actively every month to initiate the payment. It just comes automatically based on the agreement. So those are merchant initiated transactions. Then you have a TV streaming subscription. Those are the same amount every month, 10 euros, for example. And those can also be merchant initiated transactions or recurring, right? They're recurring type transactions where every month I just get charged 10 euros. It's worth noting at this stage that merchant initiated transactions require strong customer authentication when I set them up. So I'm signing up some terms and conditions. So at the point that I sign up to that agreement, I need to do a strong customer authentication. But then every subsequent transaction doesn't require strong customer authentication. And then I think the natural question will be, well, hey, I've got 10,000 customers using my subscription service today. Does that mean I need to re-authenticate them or do something different with those merchants after September? And the answer to that is no. So if you have existing agreements with customers for payments, you're a mobile phone company or you're a TV streaming subscription, then those payments that you have already set up, those agreements you have set up with merchants, customers don't change. It's only new agreements that you set up after September that require the strong customer authentication on the first occasion.
But basically, this means if you are number one, if you are having a web shop, just selling things normally, customers just enter the details and the card details and use 3D Secure, then this isn't an issue really.
Nope, nothing at all. Continue, no noticeable change for you, no noticeable change for the customer. Exactly.
But still, keep being online in this webinar. It could still be interesting.
Exactly. And
but if you're using a subscription model or a recurring model, then you really need to pay attention to this. But
pay attention for the new subscriptions for sure. The existing ones will continue as they are. So no need to worry about existing stuff. But a new process.
After the 14th of September, for hopefully you have new customers,
yes.
And you probably will have old customers changing their plans. So you, for those, or your merchant doing recurring or subscriptions, you will have to do something before the 14th of September, right?
If you're managing subscriptions, then today with existing agreements with customers, then your acquirer will take on some responsibilities behind the scenes. From September the 14th, then you need to make sure as a merchant that you are signing these agreements with a strong customer authentication. So ensuring that the person signing up for the agreement is actually who they say they are. Again, the purpose of this is only actually to prove that the person who's making the payment or agreeing to make payments in the future is who they say they are. And actually a lot of merchants already today do strong customer. So for the agreement with a card payment for services, they'll send that transaction to 3D Secure, for example, already today anyway. So even for those merchants, no change if you're doing that already today. Then the question comes, okay, I figured out as a merchant what's in scope, what's out of scope for strong customer authentication. Then how do I ensure that the transactions that need strong customer authentication, I'm doing that in the right way? And that's using 3D Secure. And I think it would be a good point to do the next poll, Patrick.
Right. Here we go. Do you send your transactions through 3D Secure or
the equivalent?
Or the equivalent, yeah, today. Yes, no, or don't know. Put in your answers. A lot of answers coming. Keep them coming. We're going to close the poll in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And there we have the last answers. I'm going to share the result with you. And here we have it. 50%. Are using 3D Secure, 23% aren't, and 27% aren't sure. And of course, 3D Secure is a standard. You don't really make an active choice to use this for most customers. It's a part of the standard package in some markets.
Yes, in some markets, the acquirer is set by default that you must use to the merchant, or PSB set that you must use 3D Secure. So I imagine those are the scenarios where you don't know, it's just happening anyway. Where there are no answers, that will have to change, I think, after September at least anyway. Yeah, but you don't have to do much to make that happen. Again, it's almost a simple conversation with your PSB. Say, hey, I'd like to activate 3D Secure. And the PSB can show you how to do that, and I'll cover that for DIBS later on as well, how you as a merchant can activate 3D Secure.
Great.
So the good news, again, just to reiterate it, whatever you're using today, if you're using 3D Secure version 1, don't worry about versions actually, but just continue using 3D Secure. And And if there are things you need to do on your side, we will reach out to you if there are any changes. I wanted to cover some of the uncertainties actually in the PSD2 world. One of them I discussed before, merchant-initiated transactions. And that's because the regulation itself leaves some room for interpretation on what a merchant-initiated transaction is. But the EBA did clarify, you don't need to read all of this, I will talk through it. But basically a merchant-initiated transactions, according to the EBA, the European Banking Authority, is where the payer has given a mandate to the merchant. They're saying, hey, you're allowed to subtract payments from my account based on the fact that I would like these products or services. A merchant-initiated transaction specifically cannot be preceded by an action of the payer. So if I have to order something or I have to put something into my basket, for example, then that's me very clearly putting an action in place in order to receive services and in order to trigger the payment. Subscriptions, for example, happen passively. As a customer, don't need to do everything every month to make the payment, for example, for my mobile phone. It just happens automatically based on the agreement with the merchant. So that's sort of the scope of strong merchant-initiated transactions and whether they need strong customer authentication or not. So when is SCA required? Either way, I'm making a customer-initiated transaction when I do something actively, or when I'm setting up a merchant-initiated transaction mandate. That's when strong customer authentication is required. Then the subsequent transactions don't need it. So what are the types of merchant-initiated transactions? Installments, typical recurring type payments, so the monthly subscriptions is the easiest to understand. There are unscheduled card on file. If you're a hotel, no-shows, for example, are also types of merchant-initiated transactions. And then how do you treat those transactions? So the first thing is that they need a strong customer authentication at the setup. Even if you're not triggering a payment itself, you need to do a zero authentication, basically. Then subsequent transactions can be submitted as a merchant-initiated transaction, and there are appropriate flags in order to do that. I would say this plus transaction ID is what the acquirer needs to do for you, so merchant don't need to do it. Existing merchant-initiated transaction agreements can continue, but the acquirer puts the transaction ID in place for you. The next, I guess, tricky topic of strong customer authentication is what's the method? Again, we discussed before that these are the three factors of authentication. But then there's been some discussion across Europe on whether, for example, SMS one-time passwords are compliant. The EBA clarified, I think just over a week ago now, that SMS passwords are not compliant with strong customer authentication. Again, that means nothing for the merchant because the issuer must ensure that they are doing it right. So issuers who use strong SMS messages. And
there's a lot of those in Europe, so they have some work to do before.
They have to make some changes.
Yeah.
Again, as long as from a merchant perspective, as long as you send the transaction to 3D Secure, you've done your bit, let's say. Yeah. And it's up to the issuer to then make sure that they are compliant with regulation and their cardholders are doing authentication the right way.
But it's a good example of the ever-changing rules here that will probably continue even after the 14th of September. There aren't any best practices yet when it comes to the nitty-gritty details.
Absolutely, I think.
But hopefully that will not affect the merchants, hopefully.
No, hopefully not. And I think from our perspective, we will try to be as clear as possible on what the merchant needs to do and make sure it's clear what the merchant needs to do versus what the issuer or acquirer needs to do. So definitely it's a changing process and changing regulatory sort of area as well. Code lists and cards, again, these types of code cards that you get in Denmark, for example, like an MID, those are also under question of whether those are actually suitable for strong customer authentication or not. And then mobile wallets, I get lots of questions on, do mobile wallets need strong customer authentication? Yes, they do, but they may do strong customer authentication differently to than just using 3D Secure. So they may have their own methods for strong customer authentication. And really to emphasize the point, right, all of these things that we've discussed are in the domain of the issuer to decide on exactly what they require. Exemptions to strong customer authentication, I think we've probably heard a lot about these. PSD2 also allows exemptions. to strong customer authentication. I just want to go through some of the examples of that. Low value payments, so for online payments under 30 euros, you may not require strong customer authentication if the issuer decides to apply that. Again, even the exemptions are optional for the issuers to provide. So they must ensure strong customer authentication. Then, depending on their risk appetite or how they'd like their cardholder experience to be, they can apply exemptions to strong customer authentication. So they can decide, hey, this is a low value payment. This is just 10 euros. I think this is quite low risk. I will just let this transaction through without asking for an SMS or bank ID or something, for example, to use tangible examples. Then they can just do low risk transactions. So depending on their fraud rate today, they can do transaction risk analysis and say, hey, this is a 100 euro transaction with low risk. This is Patrick. I know Patrick always shops with this merchant, and he's shopping at the time of day that I expect him to shop. And with a merchant in a country like Sweden, for example, where you live, this is nothing fishy about this type of transactions. I think this is low risk. I'll let that transaction through without a challenge to Patrick to do something. Then consumers can also whitelist merchants, say, hey, these are merchants I trust and I want to shop with them all the time. I don't need a strong customer authentication. They can also let their bank know.
Actually, I used that functionality just recently when shopping with my Amex card.
Yes.
So when I got the safe key window after I made put in my credit card number, I had the possibility to choose to add that merchant to the whitelist. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen anything when it comes to Visa or MasterCard, but that might be because it isn't ready.
Exactly. We have so like we discussed before, issuers are in control of this. Issuers are actually responsible for whether they want to allow exemptions or not. And American Express being a three-party scheme, they are the issuer and the scheme. So they can be ahead of the curve somewhat. They don't need to coordinate with hundreds, thousands of banks across Europe like Visa and MasterCard have to do. American Express can just set the rules for themselves, and that's what we've seen, and they are ahead of the curve in implementing this whitelisting exemption, for example. They have a bit of a head start, or it's an easier process for them.
Right.
Then let's talk about timelines. It's been a long process here, right? And the industry, I would say, is a little bit behind where it should be in terms of strong customer authentication application. And that's
with the industry, what do you mean by that?
The industry as a whole, because again, I'd like to point to, let's use DIBS as a tangible example, right? For card payments, we received implementation guides to issuers and acquirers in February of March of this year. And then once that happens, acquirers reach out to us and say, hey, you need to make some of these changes. That happened in April and May. So the acquirers take some time to digest the requirements of strong customer authentication from Visa and MasterCard. Then they reach out to PSPs and say, hey, you need to do these things and make sure that you're flagging transactions. This way, you need to make sure strong customer authentication happens. Fine, then we need to understand that, make the changes on our side. And here we are already in June now, we're informing merchants, hey, these are the things you need to do. And we're sort of only 2 months left, right? So there's a knock-on effect of one part of the value chain being behind or taking their time. So once we know what acquirers want, then we can make the changes, and then we can let merchants know what they need to do. But before that happens, we can't do anything. We're sort of passive in this. We don't set the rules and requirements. So here we are today at the end of, or actually now beginning of July. That should be a bit to the right. And we have a few months left, but now hopefully we should be in a good place to be very concrete about what needs to happen. What we don't know about today is what will happen on the issuer side. So will all of them be offering, for example, exemptions? Which SCA methods will they offer? For example, we know SMS is not going to be suitable anymore. And when will they transition to the new version of Fleet Secure? It's actually now up to individual national regulators to set the requirements for the country. So the UK Financial Services Authority has said that we are not going to enforce strong customer authentication on the 14th of September. And there's been a conversation around having a 2-year grace period after that on making sure that the whole industry is ready for strong customer authentication, so that the merchant sort of experience and the cardholder experience is not severely impacted on the 15th of September, we can't have loads of failed transactions. That's a big impact to e-commerce and payments and just commerce in general across Europe. We can't really afford to have that sort of environment on the 15th. So the UK FCA said, fine, we need more time to understand the implications for everyone to prepare for this across the value chain. So we're not going to enforce the rules of strong customer authentication on the 14th of September. We haven't heard anything from Nordic regulators on that yet. So let's finish off with the checklist, right? So what do I as a merchant need to do? What do I need to take away from this webinar? So one thing you need to do is understand how SCA will impact your transaction portfolio. So the first question I raised today, look at your transactions. Which ones are in scope and out of scope? If I am a merchant who has loads of recurring transactions, then I know that most of my portfolio is not in scope for the regulation. It's just new mandates or new subscriptions I set up from 14th of September. If I'm a merchant who just sells one-off goods, then all of my transactions will require strong customer authentication. And if I require strong customer authentication, then point 2 here is, well, those transactions need to be sent to 3D Secure or equivalent for other card schemes by the 14th of September. If you don't do that, you are really risking getting all your transactions declined. I think issuers have been very clear that they would like authenticated transactions. They won't authorize unauthenticated transactions. And then third thing, and this is not something that needs to be immediately done, so only really focus on 1 and 2 for now, but await information about the migration to 3D Secure version 2. There may be some work required for you, but your PSP and acquirer will tell you exactly what you need to do about that.
So basically, if you're doing normal transactions, using 3D Secure today, no problem. If you're not using 3D Secure or downcourt secure by nets, if you're using downcourt or AMX schemes, then you need to do something, of course.
Yes.
And if you are having recurring transactions, you also need to talk to your acquirer.
Yes.
To set up 3D Secure or...
Well, I would say, so you need to set up 3D Secure, you need to talk to your PSP or gateway, because the acquirer is not in the loop for 3D Secure, but they do set the requirements for the PSPs. So DIBS, for example, would have received, or we have received, lots of different acquirer instructions on how to implement 3D Secure. What the acquirer will tell the merchant directly is that they need to do 3D Secure, and the acquirer will make some changes behind the scenes on the transactions for recurring subscriptions. So the acquirer will put in the transaction message that this is a chain of transactions. Historically, for example, some merchants were flagging card on file transactions as recurring. That's no longer going to be possible. The acquirer will have to check that those recurring transactions are true recurring transactions. And in order to do that, they will create a transaction ID and reference the chain of payments every time towards issuer.
We have a question here. What about Net's platform NetAccept?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so NetAccept already today has 3D Secure available for merchants. If they would like to activate it, then they just need to contact support. They can email or use the phone number and say, hey, I'd just like to switch on 3D Secure, and really there should be no work required on your side, pretty much.
Another question. So SCA only applies to EU cards, but not to non-EU cards?
Yes, that's right. So American cardholders aren't, if they're coming here, for example, in Europe, then they're not playing by the same rules that we have to as European cardholders inside Europe.
Another question here. As far as I understand, DIBS will ensure cards are used with strong authentication. I will never get a call back with a card without strong authentication, I guess, at least for European cards.
So if I try to just understand the question correctly, it's DIBS will essentially ensure that you are able to use 3D Secure and send the transactions to 3D Secure. Then it's up to the issuer to do whatever they need to do to authenticate the customer. If that customer doesn't authenticate right, or it's not the right customer, then the issuer will send us a message saying the authentication has been unsuccessful, and then we can't send the approval, right? So,
but the merchant is doing his or her thing. They don't need to worry about what happens later.
No, exactly. The customer will manage the authentication with their card issuer. Nothing needs to be done necessarily on your side besides send the transaction to the right.
If you are using 3D Secure, if you are enrolled, yeah. Great.
Cool. So I just wanted to cover some payment scenarios quickly to make this really tangible. So there are three types of transactions, I guess. There's guest checkout, there's one-off transactions, there's when you set up a series of transactions, so recurring agreements or subscriptions, and then there's transactions within those. If you're a guest checkout with no card saved, then is strong customer authentication required? Yes. If you're a customer logging onto your website and I want to save my card, then strong customer authentication required. Every time a card is now stored with a merchant or on the checkout, then strong customer authentication is required, even if you're not making a transaction. But if I'm a customer that's returning and I have my card already on file or card saved with a merchant, then does that require strong customer authentication? Yes. Again, these are all one-off transactions where the customer has to do something actively. And given that they're doing something actively, strong customer authentication required. If I'm setting up a series of transactions, then the initial payment in a series of transactions also needs a strong customer authentication. And it doesn't matter if the card is saved or not saved. At that point in time, you will save the card and then trigger that subsequently to make transactions in the series. If you're making a series of transactions which have an irregular payment date, that also requires a strong customer authentication, whether you have the card already saved or not. But then transactions within the series, so I've set up a subscription in this second, let's say, row of boxes, then those transactions, the card is already on file with the merchant and they don't require a strong customer authentication, whether that's a regular series of payments or an irregular series of payments. And here's the distinction, right? So the top two, let's say, blocks are customer initiated transactions. I'm either making a payment at the checkout because I've ordered something, or I'm setting up a series. Again, I'm doing something. Those are customer initiated transactions and they all require strong customer authentication. But where I don't require strong customer authentication are the ones that are initiated by the merchant because I've already given them the mandate to do that.
We're a person who just want to check that he has understood this correctly. I'm a little confused about the in-scope and out-scope terms used in here. In-scope should have SCA and out-of-scope needs not to, is my understanding, and recurring payments initially should have SCA but not for monthly payment. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. So where to find more information? I think most acquirers have reached out to merchants just giving general guidance saying yes, please use 3D Secure from now, especially for card payments. The DIBS website is updated. So if you go dibspayment.com/SCA, you will see a breakdown of exactly strong customer authentication requirements. If you're using the hosted page or the API, then you'll also find information on what you need to do to those endpoints to just activate 3D Secure. It's a very simple guide. In order to get you equipped super fast. Again, not significant work that needs to be done. We will send you information on 3D Secure version 2. Again, that's something that comes after SCA. That's not what you need to do to be compliant. What you need to do to be compliant is make sure you're sending transactions to 3D Secure.
And also, if you're using recurring and subscription, you need to make sure that we are told that this is that kind of transaction. So if you're not doing that today, you need to flag that transaction to us.
But that's actually what we've specified in our tech site, but also in the DIBS payment SCA page. So you'll be able to see very clearly, okay, I'm a recurring transaction. This is the endpoint I need to use, and it's not a complicated story. But if you have questions, you can reach out to us.
And you need to do something.
Yes.
You need to do something before the 14th of September, which is the date, even though they have said it could be later, the banks could enforce this still.
Exactly.
On the 14th of September.
So that's generally the presentation. Let's ask questions now if there are any more. Patrick?
We have a question here. Is DIBS API ready to have PSD2 transactions on DT platform?
Yes, so if you go on this link here, I don't think I can bring it up now, but you'll find basically a split of what you need to do by DT and D2. So you'll find exactly the endpoint that you need to use and the changes you need to make. That's also on our tech site, so you can do that now.
Right, and if you're using our new platform called Easy, you don't need to do anything. In that case, everything is taken care of.
Exactly, that's one of the benefits of Easy, is we do everything for you, and we have SCA set as default. So
right, exactly.
So the don't know merchants, if they're easy, I can understand why they don't know, because it's all happening automatically.
Yeah. Exactly. So basically, this is it. For some merchant, there are some things to do. For others, there is basically nothing to do. So there are some differences here. But you can always contact us and discuss this with us if you are unsure. And of course, you should also discuss this with your acquirer, especially if you are doing something that is hard to classify.
Yeah. If you're unsure about whether you're a merchant initiated transaction or not, for example, then do reach out to your PSP or acquirer to clarify that, because it will have implications on how you flag the transactions, whether you send it to authentication or not. So good to be very clear about that.
Perfect. Thank you everyone for listening in, and thank you for Nabel sharing your insights in this subject. Everyone have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.